I've always been a big fan of Stephen King. I've read most of his books, liked and even loved a lot of them, even the ones with pretty bad endings. And I remember reading it back in high school, this behemoth of a book, and the general consensus regarding this book was that it's a phenomenal book with a terrible ending. So naturally, any adaptation covering this book and a lot of King's books has to try and figure out a way to adapt that silly little thing that's a little important, the ending. But throughout all of King's works that have been adapted, some of them met with huge and monumental success, beloved by everybody, and then there's some that didn't get the same treatment. I think that it stands as one of his better adaptations. But when it comes to adaptations, especially for a book as long as it, and even separating it into two movies, some things have to be left off screen. Now in some cases, this is a good thing, especially in the case of It. So in this video, I'm going to be going over this movie not as an adaptation, but as a duology of horror films, as a fan of the small town mystery genre, and as somebody who grew up in a town very similar to this, and technically close to this, and as somebody who hasn't watched these movies since they came out. I remember really liking them, perhaps a bit better than I do now, so let's get on our bikes, head on over to Derry, and talk about It. It Chapter 1 is about a group of friends in the town of Derry being terrorized by some sort of clown entity known as Pennywise. The friends have to band together, overcome their fears, and defeat the clown. Now, this movie had a pretty tall task to overcome. A lot of people really liked Tim Curry's portrayal of Pennywise in the 90s miniseries, and while that movie is somewhat aged, it's not that bad. So this movie had to prove its reason to exist, and also give us a reason why there were all those clown sightings around when the movie came out. Like I said, it's a book written by Stephen King, and while this movie takes place in the 80s, the book actually took place in the 50s, and it does feel that way with a lot of the outdated loser and bully stereotypes, but this movie leans very heavily into that, and the story is pretty heavily dependent on it. Being set in the 80s is also very trendy right now, and overall I do feel like it helps the story. The opening scene for the movie sets up the Bill and Georgie dynamic really well, and really lays the groundwork for the entire story. Then we get what is probably the most iconic scene of the movie, out of both of the movies, which is strange because it comes in like the first 5 minutes, but this scene has two characters and two great performances. I'm going to talk more about Bill Skarsgård's Pennywise in a bit, but this kid also puts on such a phenomenal performance. In terms of child actors, I think this kid has a really bright future ahead of him. This also sets the tone for the film pretty well. I mean, it is really crazy just how far this scene goes with its violence against a literal child, yet nothing else in the entire movie or the sequel is as dark as this scene. Maybe there's an argument for another scene or two, but this one for me definitely takes the cake. I made this point in my Super 8 video, but a super important aspect of these types of films is the friend dynamic, and this movie also gets that right. This movie is cast excellently, and the dynamic between the characters and the dialogue is easily one of the reasons why this movie is so rewatchable. I also talked a lot about movies of this genre, but It is far different than stories like The Goonies or Stranger Things or Super 8. I mean, there's definitely a reason why this movie is rated R, and those aren't. But an equally important aspect is setting up the characters. And this film has a lot of characters. This is something that I don't think the movie particularly excels at. The first 40 minutes of this movie is setting up each character and also what they're afraid of. It makes the flow of the movie and the structure a bit obvious. After the first few times, it's kind of like, okay, we get it, but it's also the only opportunity to set up the characters. Stories like this with a lot of characters are obviously better suited for TV because it allows proper time to set up everything and the characters. Here it feels very rushed and almost like an obligation instead of feeling natural, especially when some of these introductions feel like they're done better than others. Beverly and Ben's introduction is handled super well, but stuff like Stanley's intro feels tacked on, like they needed to have it because they already had him in the friend group. On one hand, all these introductions offer a lot of creativity when it comes to scares, but this is also where I kind of take issue with both of these movies. I don't find these movies particularly scary. I mean, they have their moments, but a lot of this is high school scary. You take your first date so that way she'll get jump scared and hold your hand. That's exactly what all these are, jump scares. As we start growing with the characters, there becomes a bit more attachment, so the stakes feel higher, making the scares scarier. But if you don't care about the characters and you aren't frightened by jump scares, this movie's not gonna have a whole lot for you. An aspect that I do like in this film is the town of Derry. Like I said, I'm a big Stephen King fan, and one thing he does very well as a writer is making the location and setting feel just as important as the characters are, and that's lost in a lot of King adaptations. Not all of them, but in a lot of them. Luckily, It Chapters 1 and 2, more so the first one, are not like that, and Andy Muschietti really nailed the small town feeling of Derry. It also shows that Pennywise isn't the only monster in this town, which is equally as terrifying and a subversion of the usual tropes in these movies, which I do like, and again, it's a reason why this movie is rated R. After we get each character introduction, there are great character building moments, and moments to just build up the friend group that make everything feel more natural and give us a reason to care for each person. As somebody who grew up around Maine, I can tell you that a lot of this feels very realistic. Once all the setup is done, the movie starts to really get going. The plot also feels really tangible with the kids going missing, and the stakes are very personal because Bill is still ultimately trying to find his missing brother, even though he and all the others know that he's most likely gone. And we, as the audience, know he's definitely gone. I will say that Eddie's fears and the whole scene with like the zombie homeless man chasing after him and the subsequent Pennywise reveal is actually pretty scary, and it's one of the best moments of horror in the film. Beverly's scene with the hair in the sink is also pretty horrific, but for a different reason. It's one of the only horror scenes in the film that doesn't end in a jump scare, so I respect it. It also adds some layers because Beverly's dad can't see the blood, so it adds to Pennywise and whatever scary situation is going on here, because it seems like it's only targeting children, and they're the only ones who are really affected by it. Now, sometimes this movie's tone can be all over the place. There are moments like the Rock War, which is supposed to be comedic and also really cheesy, followed up by a scene where they're all talking about their worst fears, and it's super dramatic. I just don't think these two types of scenes go along together very well in a movie. I think when the comedy is mainly based on character dynamics, it really works.
Do you use the same bathroom as your mother?
Sometimes, yeah.
Then you probably have crabs.
But some of the more, I'll say, Marvel movie type of jokes and scenes just feel like they're part of a completely different film.
Fuck you,
The well house is a setting that is absolutely needed in a movie like this. The old run-down house in town that has the stuff of urban legends attached to it. If you lived in a small town, you know exactly what I mean, but I absolutely love how over the top this creepy haunted house looks. It also helps when the well house sequence is the best sequence in the entire film. It has the buildup of suspense and also our first extended glimpse at Bill Skarsgård as Pennywise. Obviously, he's been in the movie up to this point, but we get a pretty good amount of screen time with him here, and it's the culmination of what the entire first half of the movie was setting up. It also gives a pretty reasonable explanation for how these kids can defeat Pennywise. These kids are in way over their head, but they realize that it's not real, and that's how they can defeat him. So let's talk about Bill Skarsgård. While this movie is filled with strong performances from all the child actors, Bill Skarsgård's Pennywise, Bill Skarsgård's Pennywise is absolutely incredible and the standout performance in these movies. A lot of people compare him to Tim Curry's version. I remember watching that version as a kid and being scared, but if I saw this movie as a kid, I don't think I'd sleep without the light on for like months, if not years. He absolutely crushes this role, and he does things that no other actor could have done, literally.
And he can do, like, I go, how did they do that thing in the first movie where your eye kind of goes up when Pennywise, I don't know if you guys saw the movie, but when he senses something, he kind of goes like, bah, you know, whatever, and his eye goes bah, like that. And I go, how is that a digital thing? And he went, oh, you mean this? And then he just did it.
I also love all the behind the scenes stuff about Bill and how he treated the kids.
So gross.
Hey guys, are you ready to beat the shit out of me? I can't hear you.
Just a new look for me today. Hey, how's it going? How are you? Are we gonna have some fun?
I just think this is a really, really special performance, and I know he gets a lot of praise for it, but I'm gonna give him some more because I think that praise has died down and I think he deserves more. The rest of the second act plays out how you think it would. The friends get scared and turn on each other, everybody separates, and some time passes before one of their own is taken in Beverly, and it brings the gang together again. It's always the one girl in the group that gets taken and sets up the rest of the adventure. But then in the third act, the group descends into the sewer to get Beverly back, and then we get what I believe is the silliest thing I've ever seen in a horror movie. This isn't scary. But then the boys all pull together, get Beverly back, and end up defeating Pennywise in a scene that shows all of them confronting their fears. And although we still don't quite have all the answers as to what Pennywise is and why he's doing this, that's what sequels are for. I'm sure they'll explain it there and not leave it up to the book readers to explain it to everyone. Being a fan of Stephen King, the book, and these movies, I was excited to watch this movie again. I watched this in the Discord along with a few of you, so thanks for coming to that. To those of you who did, I enjoyed our conversations about the movie, and I walked away with a few different feelings. I think watching this after Super 8 made me appreciate the R rating of this movie and how it truly leans into it, while still feeling like a small town mystery. And while I think there's some tonal and pacing issues, I still think this is a good movie and a good adaptation. It makes necessary changes, like changing the time period, and of course the exclusion of that scene. I think this movie leans a little too heavily on jump scares, but at the end of the day, I enjoy movies like this. I enjoyed the dynamic between the friends, I enjoyed the performances, and I ultimately cared about what happened at the end. So I'm going 8.4 out of 10. If the first movie had a tall order to fill, this movie had an even taller order. Especially when you consider just how successful the first movie was, this movie had to give us a cast that's just as great and has just as much chemistry as the first one had, and adapt the second part of the book It, which is already known to be the worst of the two parts. This movie definitely succeeded in one of those regards, and that's of course the casting. The casting for this movie is insane. They got some amazing A-list actors and just actual dream casting scenarios.
Jessica Chastain.
Yeah.
I forgot her name.
Yeah.
My pick is Bill Hader.
Nice. I like
sure.
that. That's
I like
great.
that one for me.
Yeah.
3 months later, they were like, hey, you got a meeting to meet with the director of It. And I was like, this Finn kid's like super powerful. Oh my God. Bring me the man who played Stefan. I want him to play me in the movie.
I want to specifically point out the guy who plays Ben. Like, this is scary casting. This is some dark level casting. If they told me this is the same person just from the future, I'd 100% believe it. The adult cast absolutely crushes it, embodies everything that the first group of friends and the actors did, and still carries that youthful childhood friendship group dynamic that this genre does so well. I also have to point out Bill Hader, especially because he adds something to this movie that no other actor could have, and for somebody who has never been in a horror movie, he did an excellent job. As for adapting the second half of King's book, well, it does poke fun at how everybody hates the ending to this book multiple times. Stephen King himself even makes the joke in the movie. With It, the book, being well known for having a bad ending, I think this movie tries to fix that in some ways. We learn of Pennywise's origin pretty early on, and some of the stuff that readers didn't enjoy are either absent in this film, or just not explained all that well, which is an interesting choice. They boil it down to, he's an alien that takes on the shape of people's fears. It puts it plainly and isn't some big twist that everybody hates in the book. Alright, now let's get into the real meat of the film and the issues it has. This movie is long, really long, way too long, especially for a horror movie. In some ways, with the pacing, it feels like you need to watch the first one, like right before this, but in other ways, there's scenes that feel like they need to remind you of what happened beforehand, so it's like, pick one. We don't need both. Either make the movie not make sense if you haven't seen the first one, or make it more accessible to everybody. They do this strange combination of both, and it surely raises the runtime. One thing I hate about this story in general is how they forget about what happened in their childhood the further they move away from the town. So this essentially means I have a fundamental disagreement with the whole plot of the film. I just generally think it's a lazy way to reintroduce the concept and the stakes, and I just think it would have been far more interesting for these characters to carry this trauma with them, and that's why they have partners or trauma that reminds them of their childhood. The reason why they end up staying is because Beverly says they're all gonna die if they don't, and I think that's a perfectly good reason on its own. The whole forgetting their past and even where they grew up is honestly just a bit confusing and makes for more unnecessary minutes.
Plus, I just remembered I grew up here like 2 hours ago, so I'm fucking leaving.
This whole forgetfulness plotline is also a plot element used to incorporate the kid actors into the story again. Now, at first I thought this was pretty clever. It was nice to see the kids again, but then this plot keeps on going, and the flashbacks continue on, and there's no real reason for these to be in the story at all, other than to capitalize on the success of the first one. Now, I don't hate all these flashbacks, but I do think they take up way too much of the film's runtime, and a lot of it could be cut out, or at the very least reduced. It doesn't help when the flashback scenes don't really do anything for the characters. And sure, it says that they do since they each have a token to find, but that is ultimately just a tool to use the flashbacks, and this is used throughout the entire second act, showing us interwoven scenes of past and present characters learning what they need to in order to move on, and also what they were/are afraid of. Some of these scenes are great, others not so much, but no matter what, they start to feel a little tiresome after the third or fourth scene. And there's a scene dedicated to each and every one of the adults, except Stanley. Sorry, Stanley. The best one by far is Beverly going back to her old apartment. It's also easily the scariest scene across both movies. It utilizes tension and suspense perfectly, and it isn't just a jump scare at the end. I wish that both of these films had more scenes like this. But these flashbacks are also a bit strange when you take the timeline into consideration, because some of these scenes took place after they defeat Pennywise, some before, and it's like, why didn't any of this get brought up in the first movie? It all feels like an easy way to bring back the child actors and get some new scares in there, which is ultimately pretty cheesy. It's also not really a plot either, it's just like side missions the movie. Another negative about all these flashback scenes is how we barely got to see any more additional Derry scenes. A lot of the scenes in the present are either calling back to the first movie or showing us where stuff from the first one is now. The opening scene showed us some new stuff in Derry, the first act also showed us this, but after that it's like this film became allergic to do new things with this town and this era. There's a montage scene of Stanley giving a speech with all the others with their stories interwoven, and it's the best flashback for sure. I feel like they could have had this scene and cut back on a lot of the personal story times and the effect would be the same. After all the flashbacks are done, we get to move on with the story of the present, with Henry Bowers coming back to try and kill them, and the group all grappling with their fear and their past, and I feel like this is when the movie actually gets going, which is strange, because at this point we're well over the halfway mark in the movie. We go back to the well house and have a showdown there, and then again in the sewers, because that's what the first one did, so they do it again here. Now, in the third act, I feel like the symmetry makes sense, and I think it's done really well. I think this is where the flashback scenes make the most sense. It impacts the characters and their arcs, and they all come together really well. We also get this gem of a scene from Bill Hader.
Let's dance! Yippee-ki-yay, motherfucker!
And in the end, the power of friendship and words defeat the monster, literally. The ending and epilogue wrap up the storylines and the characters nicely, almost too nicely. Like, I'd consider this 100% to be a happy ending. I actually think the entire third act is done really well. Same with the first act. It's just the entire second act with all the flashbacks that doesn't quite do it for me, and it's unfortunate because that's obviously most of the movie. I think because the first one was so successful, they were kind of afraid to take risks in this one. They copied the exact same structure, sometimes even the exact same scares, and relied so heavily on flashbacks and the younger actors that it felt like the older cast was underused, which is super unfortunate because I felt way more invested in the present story and in learning more about these characters now than I did whenever there were flashbacks. Overall, I'm going 6.7 out of 10. I still like this movie, I still think it's a good follow-up, but it still has a lot of missed potential. Usually this is the time that I talk about any upcoming new movies and whatever franchise I'm talking about, but there is no It Part 3 coming. I mean, not yet. These movies were hugely successful, so who knows, we might get a third one where they're like, somehow Pennywise returned. There is, however, going to be a prequel series called Welcome to Derry coming to Max in 2025. I hadn't heard anything about this until I was doing research for this video, but yeah, it's coming, and it's not like they have only announced it, they've filmed it, and there are some screenshots for it. No official trailer or anything yet, but I'm assuming that's going to be coming soon. Maybe you're watching this because the trailer just came out, I don't know. But the show is going to be set in the 60s and is supposedly going to cover more about the origin of Pennywise. Andy Muschietti, the director of both It movies, is returning to direct multiple episodes and serve as the producer of the show. But the big question is if Bill Skarsgård will be reprising his role as Pennywise. So far, that answer is no. How are they gonna tell the origin of Pennywise without Pennywise? I don't know, and if they're gonna recast him, I mean, you might as well not even do this show. But the series sounds intriguing, and hopefully Bill can return for at least one episode of the show. Those are my thoughts on both It movies. What are your thoughts? Let me know in the comments below, and if you enjoyed the video, make sure to leave a like and subscribe for more content like this. Special thanks to all my channel members, and I'll see you all in the next one.
Yeah.